All right, let's go ahead and kick things off. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today for our webinar with analog devices and Aero electronics. I'm Brittany Nelson, Partnerships Manager at Indiegogo, and here with me today is Keaton Anderson, Engineering Manager at Aero. Analog Devices is the official semiconductor technology provider of the Aero certification program, which enables entrepreneurs to interpret the world around them with unmatched technologies that sense, measure, and connect. The Aero certification program is our initiative to help you with prototyping, sourcing components, manufacturing challenges, and other important steps before and after your crowdfunding campaign. The program is 100% free and offers benefits like one-on-one engineering reviews, manufacturing consultations with their team of experts, and discounts on components from aero.com. Just a quick note for the presentation, if you have any questions, please use that Q&A button at the bottom, and we will try to address all of your questions at the end. All right, I think without further ado, Keaton, why don't we get started?
Perfect. Thanks, Brittany. So hi, everyone. My name is Keaton Anderson. I am an electronics engineering manager at Aero Electronics. My role mainly consists of getting to work with startup companies and getting to be a part of the Aero certification program. I get to see a lot of really cool and fun projects. So I'm really excited to be a part of this. I'm really excited to get a chance to do this webinar. I'll give a disclaimer at the start that I am not a farmer. I'm just a guy who really enjoys technology. So there might be a few people out there who know a little bit more than me. I'm always excited to hear about what you're doing and really excited to get to hopefully work with a bunch of you in the program. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick off. So let's talk a little bit about what I'm going to go through today. So the first is going to be just kind of an overview and a basics of agriculture. And this hopefully will not be too remedial, but I want to make sure that we're kind of setting a level playing field for where everyone should be of just kind of what are the different technologies we're going to be talking about, what's kind of the basics of what we're going to be covering from an agriculture perspective. Then I'm going to go into essentially how can IoT change plant growing. So IoT is kind of this real interesting buzzword that we hear a lot around. People say, what is the Internet of Things? How is it going to grow? They're talking about how many billions of devices are going to be on the network. We're going to try to look at a little bit more of the practical side of it, of how is it going to impact things, hopefully within kind of the next 5 years, or what's actually already available and kind of live from there. From there, I'm going to talk a little bit about analog devices, the smart ag solutions. This will be a little bit around kind of the ecosystem that Aero has from a grow house perspective. Analog devices is, as kind of Brittany had mentioned, they're the semiconductor partner for the Aero certification program. And really, there's a reason we select them. These guys are the best in terms of precision. They are able to kind of build the devices that you're going to need to really take things to the next level. And so there's a reason that we're working with them, and I'm really excited to talk about some of the products that they have. And then the last thing is I'm going to go through the Aero certification program a little bit and talk about kind of how we get involved with companies, what's that look like, and how we could potentially work with you. So I'm going to start first with kind of just the basics of this. So this is going to be my plant. My plant's name is Carl. I actually was going to show you guys a real grown plant, but I do not have a green thumb, so it died. So unfortunately, this is what I'm going to be using as a digital representation. So whenever you see this, this is my plant that I am going to be covering through. So what are some of the basic needs that are going to be going through when I'm growing a plant? So the first one I talked about would be around distance. So it's important to be able to have kind of that spatial land as a whole. And this is something that if you look at some of the bigger costs around farming, one of the things that's going to be a consistent thing is around space and land. And that's probably why, when we'll talk a little bit later around vertical farming, we'll talk a little bit about how some of that system is going to be built out. But one of the key things to kind of keep in mind is you obviously have things like roots, you have, space in terms also limits the amount of crops that you're going to be able to place. So if you're able to only put in kind of one zone, obviously you're limited by the number of crops that you can put in there. The other piece there is that so you're going to have to be able to rotate on different kind of plots to be able to make sure that you're not running out of the nutrients too quickly. And so this is an area that when we're thinking about plants, one of the key things that's going to be a constraint is space in terms of both horizontally and potentially vertically. How could we integrate between the two of those? The second one, and this is kind of the basics, is just water. So plants need water for growth. Water is an interesting and a tricky one because you obviously have natural ways, but then you need to be able to still track the moisture around how often should that plant be watered? What's an optimal level? Should it be watering for a longer time and then more time in between? Should I be doing shorter durations and more frequent? There's a ton of different discussion around that piece. And one of the interesting things is being able to then use moisture sensors to be able to talk about how can we determine where that water and where that moisture concentration is at. The next one is going to be light. And this is, in particular, when we're looking at outside growing and kind of more of a traditional aspect, obviously that's going to be solar. But then when we start to look more at some of these internal in these building kind of setups, you're going to be able to see, hey, this is going to be LED based setups. And one of the things that's really interesting is looking at those setups in terms of the different kind of colors of light concentrations. If you look at more of a indoor grow house or greenhouse, you would be fascinated by just the different colors that are coming in. I think, I'm used to go outside and I just kind of appreciate that it's sunlight. But, when we're looking at kind of that optimal growing perspective, there's a lot of reds, there's a lot of blues. They're very particular, and the frequency of the wavelength spectrum is actually very particular to optimizing that growing pattern. And then the last one here, it's represented by a cloud because I couldn't really figure out how to do this otherwise, but it's going to be talking a little bit about gas mixtures. So you obviously have that when things are outside, there's a gas mixture just associated with the air. Obviously, you have a percentage oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, so on and so forth. But when we're looking at it in terms of a greenhouse, you'll often find many circumstances where they're going to end up having to pump in carbon dioxide to be able to make sure that the plants have things to consume and then use to grow. So it's really a fascinating process when you start to think about these environments, that they're little micro chambers where we're having to create kind of perfect ideal growing conditions to want to try to accelerate plant growth. Whereas, if I'm planting outside, I may just be trying to give it some fertilizer and water and hoping things go. This is very particularly focused around how do we optimize that? How do we build out that growth? So some of the things that I'm going to talk about in particular around the IoT aspect of agriculture is going to be drones, kind of water management, this machine control and automation, and then that soil monitoring and sensing. And what's really interesting is that obviously some of these technologies have been around in different applications. So, drones are starting to move a little bit more into kind of the hobbyist space. People are able to play with it. You've also, people are using them for photography in many ways and professional. But one of the interesting applications there is when you start to think about it from more of an automated perspective, just kind of some things that'll go. And actually, I'll just dive into that piece. So drones can be used for a lot of different purposes within the agriculture. Actually, Aero had a chance to work recently with a community locally in Colorado that we were kind of asking them, where would the benefit be? How would you be able to use this? And we kind of got some really interesting insights out of that conversation. So when we think around drones for field monitoring, one of the things that's going to be kind of first noticeable is that you have something that's not just a fixed camera apparatus. So I'm not going to just be able to see kind of one view and, hey, if the sun's changed, that's just kind of the way that it works, I have to put light or something like that. Drones enable you to be able to start to survey your field over a wide array and not necessarily have to be physically next to those plants. And this creates some really interesting things. So there's a lot of technology that's out there, different companies that are working on it, being able to use essentially camera inputs and determining, hey, are these plants getting sick? Are we able to see early signs of infection? Are we able to help kind of remove some of those obstacles so that when we are looking at the overall harvest, we can potentially start to try to protect the overall crop? Or are we able to see like, hey, is there an infestation that we need to go after? And then likewise here, what you can kind of see from this picture is you can then potentially be able to go out and deploy particular medicines or pesticides associated with those to a local area. And so if instead of me having to walk, whatever that distance may be or drive whatever that distance may be, you could be able to react quicker to that and use a drone as a way to be able to deliver those means. So it's a really interesting kind of idea. Obviously, these are significantly bulkier and significantly heavier than a lot of more of your typical drones, but it's a really interesting operation means. And if you start to think about the automation around that, You could potentially have it where you could have multiple drones going out a day, taking a look at the field, making sure everything's growing as expected. And then the farmer would only have to go and deal with the problem areas. You only have to go and you can address those immediately. Um, and these get even more powerful when you start to look at the overall ecosystem. I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go. The second piece is this water management thing. And so I was looking up the amount of water that it takes to grow an almond. There's a study that was kind of talking a little bit about this, but the amount of water that that it takes to grow different plants, it can be kind of a large amount. And this isn't a like, hey, I need to go into a water conservation thing. Moreover, just talking that watering is required to grow plants, and understanding and managing the water is key from both an ability to make sure that you're keeping your costs at an appropriate level, as well as making sure that you're aware of kind of keeping those optimal growing conditions that we had alluded to earlier. So when you're looking at kind of that sensing portion, that moisture sensor that you're going to be able to place in the ground, if you can be able to use that and deploy kind of a network across the field, you can start to get a better feel for, hey, where's the areas that I'm getting standing water, or I may be getting too much moisture? Can I be able to reduce that? And unfortunately, I wasn't able to capture necessarily the machine here, but everyone has kind of seen when you're out and you have kind of those long kind of rows, and they're the watering machines, and they have the wheels, and they can kind of move across the field. If you think about that, that's kind of somewhat can be a little bit static, right? So that you're just kind of pumping water in, and it's going to be able to kind of just mist across the field. When you start to think about how can we be smarter and how can IoT improve this, if you're able to kind of track the moisture levels across different areas, now you can be able to water some more, water some less, and try to keep it consistent across the entire plane. So it's not just one area that's going to be just receiving a ton of water because we're just keeping it unilateral. We're now starting to look at how can we water particular to the areas of our field, and they may be different, right? And we may see, hey, I need to try to shrink back here a little bit. And then obviously that would help us if we've had a day, some of it's more, just by traditional practice. If it's, had a day of full rain, you may not necessarily need to water as much. This starts to give you a little bit more of a quantifiable metric to that, and helps with kind of understanding what is that exact level that we're trying to keep things at. And again, this is a little bit more about traditional. I'll talk a little bit more about indoor in a second, but just something that you can look at is that water management aspect. And then speaking of machines, the next kind of piece that you can look at here is around this machine control and automation. And this is, of all of the things that I probably will talk about, this is one of those more a little bit further out in terms of how this is going to be developed. So as you can imagine right now, it typically is something where if I have someone who I have to have driving a tractor, I have to have a single person that I'm going to assign to, hey, I just got to drive that, and be able to make sure that I'm using that to, either doing for harvest or whatever portion I may have for that. When I'm looking at this longer term, and when we're talking about where some of this is going to go, being able to use automation and automated driving and pieces like that helps enable this kind of ecosystem where you could potentially have multiple machines working on different pieces of the field that are just kind of controlled by a single person, and being able to automate some of that productivity. And essentially, right now, some of the aspect of this is, hey, I have one person who, I'm getting up at 6 a.m. or even earlier trying to get out there and beat, the sun, get some things done. Now, when I'm looking at this, can I potentially have some of this work being done? Can I be monitoring it live? Can I be making sure that things are working as expected? And I think when you start to see the whole ecosystem of smart ag, it builds upon the sensing and then tying that to an automation tactic. And you've seen this somewhat in more traditional commercial, where you have things like sensing for occupancy within buildings and being able to turn off the lights if they're not there. You have the sensing for temperature to be able to make sure that you're controlling and monitoring. And when you start to think about that from an automation within agriculture, you can now start to think about, hey, I need to be able to try to send out a harvest to this end while also simultaneously watering on this section. And I'm going to be rotating different pieces of that. And again, you could use drones to be able to go out and view certain patches to make sure, hey, is that technology, am I expecting to see am I seeing the yield that I would expect from that area? So machine control and automation, I think this is probably an area that's going to be a blanket across all different industries. We're talking medical, and we're talking industrial, manufacturing, things like that. These are going to be kind of the main technology, but being able to understand machine position and then drive appropriate to it is something that is going to be a huge growth area. It'll be, years in the future, but this is kind of something that is going to be one of those big game changers once it starts to get kind of figured out a bit more. And then the last one, and I put this last because I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this one, is this soil monitoring. So I've kind of talked a little bit about this already, but these is going to be around how sensing works within determining appropriate growth environments. And so if you would imagine, if you're deploying a network of this, you can start to get a better feel around what is the actual conditions in my field from a pH perspective, from a moisture perspective, being able to, if you use a light sensor to determine what's the exact amount of sunlight that I'm getting, things like that. And being able to then use this as kind of this neural network where we can say, hey, do I have a certain plot that's not getting as much moisture, or am I seeing a difference in pH in that area? And, some of this is, you can learn some of the optimal pieces of it and then hopefully be able to try to keep everything at a stable level. But this is more in many ways going to be this kind of reactionary idea, right? So it's kind of that idea of when you take a temperature check and something seems off, hey, you're going to want to try to go to the doctor. You're going to want to look at that. Likewise, you want to try to use this somewhat preventatively to make sure that we are keeping an idea of where is the levels at, but then obviously being able to deploy to the areas that need help immediately to try to make sure that we're kind of, again, maximizing yield and making sure that we are kind of keeping all of our ecosystem, all of our farm and our plants at the same level. Okay, that's kind of more of my traditional pieces. I'm gonna talk a little bit about some types of indoor growing facilities. I'm gonna have a few pictures. So the ones that I have pictures for are these. But what you're starting to see is, let's think about an environment that would not be conducive at all to growing. So if you have somewhat like more of an Arctic environment where, hey, I may not be able to plant and grow during that timing in that frame, that will end up kind of causing some issues with yield. Or if I'm in more of an urban environment, I'm not going to be able to necessarily plant. So some of the things that have become more of the future of what we're going to see is these container farms, these indoor vertical farms, these greenhouses that, they've talked about potentially doing things in like parking garages, right? Where you can just have these layers of these self-contained areas that they're going to be able to grow plants in. And so one of the things that's really interesting to think about is, instead of having to have everything grown away and then shipped in, it's this more of this local kind of aspect. And I know there's probably some questions around, what are some of the challenges behind this? What are going to be some of the things that, why is this not taken off as potentially as quickly? And we'll talk a little bit about that. But just when you're kind of thinking of these, some of what they're going to look like is, you have these kind of self-contained ecosystems. So you're going to have a way to be able to kind of do more of a mass production of fruits and vegetables inside. As you can see there, kind of as I had mentioned earlier from those light fixtures, potentially in many circumstances when we were working with companies who do LEDs for particular around growing plants, you're going to see a strong concentration of those deep reds and those blues that are going to come through. Likewise, you have that picture there in the middle, that's that hydroponics. So this is kind of that growing solution that's going to be involved in that kind of concentration of water. And then as well, we have the vertical farming. And so this is saying, hey, can I grow upward instead of trying to go outward? And what you can start to think about here is, when you're thinking about, hey, instead of it having to be that I'm driving through, Kansas or something, I just see farm as far as I can go, I'm starting to look at now, hey, could I potentially have this in a downtown environment where I'm growing plants in particular to source locally to people right nearby? And again, we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges around that, but these are some of the options that are going to be really important to the future. And when you look at some of the other options here, so this is particular around that container facility that I was highlighting earlier. So you could see, you could have an environment where it's snowy, it's potentially very cold, but we're able to maintain an ecosystem that is within the temperature range that you'd want to, as well as those kind of gas concentrations, light concentrations, and these can potentially help decrease some of the time required to have plants go from just seeds all the way through kind of that growth and that harvest perspective. So I'm going to jump a little bit into a particular of the grow house solution specific to Aero and to analog devices, and talk a little bit about how that hardware is set up. I'm going to have a few examples here, and I'll talk a little bit in particular around some of those parts. So when I kind of look at it, when we have our system overview, what it includes is that IoT gateway with a soil monitoring node. And then you're going to have kind of that LED for control. And these are going to be able to be configured over kind of the mobile app. And then you'll have a dashboard to be able to do so through kind of your cloud portal. And so what this ends up looking like from a block diagram perspective is you're going to have a lot of this being done over a Zigbee control. So you have your control modules built in. Those have those Cortex M4s, so the brains aspect of it. And then these devices will have different pieces. So at the top there, when you look at that soil end node, we're obviously doing an analog to digital conversion. I'll talk a little bit about the particulars of the ADI part on that. And then those are going to both the pH and the moisture sensor. Likewise, on that LED node, as I had talked about before, you're going to have kind of the power and then dimming control to be able to change how intense the light is, as well as being able to control what modules are going live, that kind of thing. And then you'll have a gateway that kind of does all the backhaul. So it'll talk to the node to be able to say, hey, what's going on? Can you kind of give me an update on where the pH and moisture are? Then I'm going to go ahead and feed that information back to the cloud so I can have kind of that overall layout. And this is kind of somewhat the basics of an IoT network. So if you've seen something like this before, for different applications, you will have kind of some of your nodes and then potentially a backhaul and that data gateway to be able to handle most of the processing so that your nodes can be smaller and require less power. So what this looks like actually in practice is, here's what the hardware overview, and I have links to some of this for aero.com. So you have your soil node there, you have your soil and pH, your moisture and pH sensors. And then you also have your gateway and your LED node with the engine there. And these are actually pretty friendly. And that was one thing that I was really impressed by is that, hey, I'm going to put in some batteries into this system, be able to hook up those nodes and put them into the soil. And then I can connect kind of my Ethernet, my 12 volt for the data backhaul. And those are going to go via Zigbee and BLE back. So this has the connections for both the node for the soil as well as the light environment, and then it goes back to the gateway. So this is interesting because it is something that if you want to kind of start from a system that you said, hey, I don't have a previous engagement on this, that I'd like to be able to just kind of jump in and start working on it. This is an idea of something that you could be able to use. Obviously, different systems will use different protocols. If you're a little bit more long range, you may not be able to use certain communications protocols because they're kind of small, depending on the size, but this was just kind of our basic example of what that looks like. And I want to talk a little bit, I had just highlighted there kind of that analog to digital converter, and this is one of the places that I wanted to end up highlighting analog devices. So the part that we're going to look at is this 807124. And if you're familiar with kind of what an analog to digital converter is, you're going to see some kind of standard things here. There's going to be a MUX, you're going to have some power gain amplifiers, you're going to have a Sigma Delta ADC. But one of the really important things and one of the reasons why we've partnered with analog devices is around that precision, right? So being able to get precise measurements for this environment is probably just as critical as it could be, maybe a little bit more so sometimes in medical, but in this example, if you're starting to think about, hey, if I have to really keep that moisture level at a very precise concentration, being able to have those bits of precision really enables you to make sure that you're bringing the absolute optimal conditions to it. And when you start to think about, a process that potentially has a very large chance of you have some potential to be able to fail. You have some potential that the growth could not be as where you want it to be. Every single plant that you can get to grow optimally is going to be important to the yield and then obviously the overall profitability. So one of the reasons why we really are excited and really grateful that we get to work with analog devices is that we know, hey, if you're going to plug something into the system, I know for sure that it's going to bring you exactly what you need from a precision perspective, and that you're not going to have any issues in terms of quality. They're kind of the top end from that perspective. Likewise, you can also look a little bit here at this ADP 2108. So this is going to be one of the power chips. If you've seen these before, this is pretty standard. You have an input voltage, you have a switch, and then the feedback loop with an enable on and off to be able to kind of set those particular voltage range. And so that light engine that we were talking about earlier and that soil node, those are going to be some of the pieces that are included there from both an analog to digital converter and the power perspective. And one of the reasons that it's built on analog devices is, again, just because we trust the company. They really deliver high quality devices, and that's one of the reasons why they're ending up in that design from an Aero perspective. And then we have a couple of useful articles here that goes a little bit into kind of that grow house solution. and talk to you a little bit more about smart ag, smart horticulture as a whole. These are going to be available on Aero.com. If you go to the articles and videos and you just type in Aero Grow House, you can be able to find them. Here's also the links for them. I don't want people to feel like they're jotting it down, but if you get a snip or a screenshot or something like that, but otherwise you can go there. It's Aero.com. We always have engineering chat available, so if you need any help finding it, just reach out to the team and we'll help make sure that you get taken care of. The last thing I am going to talk about is the Aero certification program, and this is my baby. I get a chance to work with this on a regular basis, so I'm really excited about what we get to cover here. So the Aero certification program, the idea behind it is this partnership between Aero and Indiegogo around how do we make sure that when entrepreneurs are coming on the platform, they have all the tools that they need from an electronics and an engineering perspective to be able to get their product all the way from ideation through production and into that end of life and those second iterations phase, right? And so we started this program. It's been a long time now. I think it started back on this in 2016. And the whole goal behind this was being able to make sure that we had a way to have people who are entrepreneurs come and engage with us at an earlier stage in their design. So this wasn't a thing that, hey, I'm a year in the road, I'm running out of my budget, and now I have a lot of questions. We want to try to help them as soon as possible, and we're able to kind of engage at any step. But we were really excited about the opportunity to be able to start to talk to entrepreneurs at even an earlier stage. So when someone comes onto the Indiegogo platform and they have a really great idea, they may not necessarily have all the skills that they need to be able to get that. And one of the expertise areas that Aero can offer is around knowing. We've seen a lot of different things come through before. We've worked with many different companies. So being able to go in and say, hey, we understand the question that you have and we have a good idea of where to go, be able to give you that answer immediately. Or if you have issues with supply chain or production, those are some of the aspects that Aero can help with. And I'll go to the next slide to talk a little bit more about the particulars around it. We do have the ability to get up to $1,000 off of Aero components and services. So this is something that we recognize that budgets are tight. We recognize that you're trying to get as much funding as possible, but sometimes it's nice to have a little bit of help. So this is something that we like to provide. We also offer that social media and newsletter promotion, as well as the big one that I get to participate in is that engineering consultation. So you'll get an opportunity to meet with one of our engineers and just to kind of discuss your design. And we've had a chance to really work with some really cool people. We actually had a smart ag project that came through that they were looking at how can I start to make growing a little bit more scalable even in the home, right? How can we do it on more of a one-on-one where instead of me potentially having to plant a garden outside, I can start to have it where this IoT, this smart ag is more even localized to my personal house. So we have that both that engineering and the manufacturing consultation. That's something new. If we've talked about this before, you may have not heard of it. So we do offer a chance to be able to sit down and talk with one of our manufacturing experts to say, hey, I have some questions around where's the best place to select a CM, what should I be doing, what kind of files should I bring. They're experts who all they do all day is just try to help you from getting your project through that production, even the first kind of wave and then all the way through mass production. So that's something that we're really excited about. And then the last one is that badge for your Indiegogo campaign. We had shown it there on the previous slide, but I didn't necessarily hit on it as much, but campaigns that do have that Aero certified technology badge, they're going to be ones that both raise more funds and are more likely to hit their goal. And so we're really proud of that. We're really proud of the fact that we've had a chance to work with some really cool companies. And I've been really grateful to have a chance to work with this program. So I'm excited to see what else is going to come through, and I'm excited about hopefully getting some people from this webinar to come and kind of meet with that. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Brittany and move on to some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Keaton. That was great. All right, we do have a few questions from beforehand and then also in the Q&A. So let me pull these up. The first question here is, why do a lot of vertical farming projects in the market fail?
Yeah, and I had mentioned that I alluded that I was going to answer this one, so I'm glad I get this question. So when you start to think a little bit about this, there's probably a bunch of different factors that play into this. A couple of the first things that you'll have to think about is going to be around that initial investment. So not everyone's going to want to jump into that because there's a lot of sensors and networks that you're going to need to deploy there. So that's obviously one piece of it. But then there's a whole nother layer that comes into being location of where is this placed, the supply chain, how are you getting into some of the places that you're actually going to be delivering those? Did you potentially go too wide from a growth perspective of what are the different, and I don't mean wide spatially, I mean wide in terms of the different products that you have. Sometimes it's important to be able to focus on just one aspect, one plant, maybe I'm just growing lettuce or something like that, to be able to bring to the market. So when we start to look at why are some of these ventures failing, it's really that this is a whole new endeavor, this is a whole new area, and you're going to see a lot of attempts, and someone will eventually get it really right, and kind of explode from that perspective. But this is kind of still in that experimentation phase where people are trying new things. We've maybe got a little bit better from the technology perspective, but in terms of being able to deliver that one solution that's going to be kind of really strong, or potentially multiple people doing that kind of similar solution, there's just a lot to have to learn to kind of coming from both generating a business and kind of figuring out this new and unexplored territory. So I think when you're seeing kind of some of these vertical farming endeavors fail, I don't think it's necessarily because it's that they weren't strong or that they weren't able to do it well. I think you're pioneering a completely new space, and so you see a lot of new iterations and new entrepreneurs getting into it. I think, if you look at the industry of something like ride sharing, just 10 years ago, I don't think it was a space that was being pioneered, and there was a lot of endeavors from that front. So I think there's a lot of factors that go into it, but some of those are just particular around that it's a new kind of business, and that there's a lot of costs and focus that are not necessarily completely trimmed out so that you have as many players there.
Definitely. All right. Next question is a little long, so bear with me.
Okay.
The ultimate goal of smart agriculture is to sustain healthy vegetation. So what sensors or methods exist to actually measure the health and comfort of the plants, trees, grass, etc. to close the loop? Can we easily measure and monitor moisture level, temperature, pH, etc.? But how can the plant's response to these environmental factors be monitored other than just visual inspection? For example, how can we scientifically determine if longer irrigation less frequently is healthier? Are there appropriate and inexpensive sensors for this purpose?
Yeah, and so this is a great question. I think some of what we have from a technology perspective right now is very limited from that kind of. I talked a little bit before about it's this quantifiable perspective. So I can be able to determine, hey, where's the moisture level at? Where's that pH level at? I talked a lot about that during the presentation, but I think this kind of this factor of understanding, where a plant's comfortable, or potentially what does that look like? A lot of that's done through kind of this trial and experiment perspective. So, hey, we're going to try with this conditions. We know that the optimal red is at this particular wavelength, right? And then we're going to try it a little bit different over here. We're going to try it a little bit different over here, to see kind of where that ends up and what the total growth is. And they're starting to get a little bit better about understanding what it is that is going to drive that massive growth and what's going to help kind of move things, and kind of reduce grow time. And I've had a chance to work with quite a few lighting companies in this space. And it's really interesting to see the science that's gone behind, them testing kind of those different wavelengths. But I do think, to kind of the question, that there's probably even more potential for growth around just being able to understand how plants are responding. And to a certain extent, the point that you made around visual cues is probably the best way that it's being done currently. But I do think that there's potential for growth here. And this is an area that, as technology gets better, smaller, as it's going to get more lightweight and require less power, you're going to be able to deploy larger sensor networks that are not necessarily as potentially power hungry or going to be demanding as for getting it set up. And I think that that's when you're going to start to see this flip of having a better idea of, can we understand particular each plant, where are they at, how are they doing? I think right now, though, it is definitely more of that quantifiable. Where's the pH? Where's the moisture? What's the level that I'm delivering from a light perspective? And then what are we seeing from a return from growth on that? So hopefully room to grow it and new technology to come.
Awesome. All right, next question here is, do you feel these IoT devices will be a single use or single season item? If not, how will the sensors be removed from the soil, plant prior to harvest and tilling of the ground?
Yeah, also a great question. So I think when you look at it, there is kind of two different philosophies of this. I don't think that we're really at a single use sensor perspective. A lot of these are going to be networks that are deployed and then are kind of static. So once they're there, we're determining it. But to that point, you're not necessarily going to have something that's a single season deployment. And I think you're starting to see across multiple different industries where the single use or the single season sensing is becoming much more common. I had a chance to work with Medtronic at one point, and they were talking just a little bit about how as it gets cheaper, that technology perspective, just from even like a sanitation perspective, you start to see more of these aspects where, hey, I'm making these medical devices and I'm potentially kind of going to dispose of them. And I think likewise that this will apply to that industry potentially as it gets cheaper. The caveat I will make there is that um, the responsible and the responsible recycling of electronic components is a big aspect here, and there's a lot of requirements around how do you get rid of them. There's a lot of compliance things around how to recycle those components. How do you make sure that you're not ending up with the wrong type of materials within the ground? So my guess is that until that area has grown significantly and we're able to say we feel comfortable with how that looks like from an environmental perspective, you won't see as many of those single-use deployments. You're going to see something more like I'm either going to leave a fixed sensor network and I'm just going to have it where it's deployed across all of my fields, or I'm going to be able to go in and at the end of the season after I've done harvest, I'll go ahead and remove those and then kind of stake them in the ground in another place and kind of keeping those fixed elements. So I don't think we're completely at the single-use spot. I do think it's going to be more of either a fixed network, but that really depends, I think, on if technology is going to get potentially at a point where you can feel very environmental around, hey, I know that that's going to be okay for both my soil and for the environment in general.
Definitely, definitely. All right, I'm going to paraphrase this question a little bit.
Okay.
I think basically the question is like, do the sensors need to be connected to cellular IoT if they're stationary, or is that only when they're moving around on a drone or maybe moving around on a field on wheels? Like, I guess stationary versus something that's in motion connected to a drone, is the IoT part really necessary?
Yeah, so in theory, you could be able to deploy these networks where you don't necessarily have it where you're doing kind of that data backhaul or that communication and it's kind of staying more static. You'd have to go out to every single node and plug in or take a look or visually write down. So these become really useful and really helpful from reducing a time and maximizing productivity perspective when you're able to do that connection from that IoT perspective. I think when you start to look at things in motion, the reason why it's important to have those drones is, and why they can potentially be very beneficial, is that you don't have to worry about deploying these multiple static cameras. Hey, what if I can't get the right angle? What if things are not in that right area? You're able to potentially get even closer, then you might be able to get better resolution on that. And then the last piece, and I kind of alluded to this on the drones, is, okay, so if you have those static cameras and you've deployed them out and they're just kind of standing there, how do I actually go out and action on that? Is there a way to be able to go and start to deploy? And those drones have that way where you can start to include those tanks where, hey, I can deal with that problem immediately. I can deal with that right now while I'm using this product. Whereas otherwise you're looking at, do I have a sprayer network? What's the precision on that? Can I get it exactly on the plant that I want? Or do I need to go out there? So there are some advantages to why you would want to use that kind of mobile piece, but I think you're looking at a conjunction of both a fixed network where you're reporting back that data to understand what problems exist, and then potentially having something like a drone that you can deploy to action it immediately. So I think the IoT piece there kind of helps from that overall landscape perspective, but you could do it a little bit more static as a step one kind of cheaper aspect, and then work up to it. But I do think as you look at longer term for the yield, that'll be something that more people go to that IoT solution.
Makes sense. All right, next question. What is the best ROI for adoption?
Yeah, so this is like this can be a little bit challenging as well. So when you're looking on return of investment of, hey, I want to be able to go ahead and I'm going to grow one plant. For example, I could buy one soil node, I could buy one pH sensor, and I could be able to grow that. And your return on investment might take a long time to pay for that, right? If you're trying to sell it one plant at a time. So from a return on investment perspective, what you're starting to think about here is what are the things that are going to help most from a mass perspective, right? And that could be more on that sensing network, but you're probably not getting as many sensors in that particular. So if I use the one sensor at one plant example, that's not going to be a high return. But if I have one sensor that covers hundreds of plants and it's just a relative idea of what the pH and moisture is in, say, the center of that plot, now I start to get a little bit of a better feel. And this is kind of this is talking a little bit to that same idea of like how accurate can I get my weather, right? Like if I have like local weather nodes every like meter, I can get a really good idea of what it is exactly there. Likewise, the more nodes that you deploy across your farm, you're going to have a better idea of what that looks like across the entire ecosystem. So I would say that if it was me trying to do a return on investment, I would probably start with nodes first, and deploy them for multiple plants. And then as I was able to scale that up a bit more, if I needed better precision, I'd add more nodes to it. But if I was just doing, for a local, if I was doing it, say, for I'm wanting to use farm, I don't know why, my plant bed in the backyard, then I would be able to just deploy, say, the one sensor node there. And that would be kind of what I would do from there. Garden, that's the word I couldn't think of. Sitting there like, how do I say garden? Like I'm playing catchphrase.
All right, so the next question is, do you think indoor farming will be important in the future? How much of future growth is indoors and water versus indoors and dirt, or outdoors and dirt? So I guess, like, what are you seeing in the market right now in terms of these three kind of options?
Yeah, I think that, so to answer the first question, do I think indoor farming is going to be important for the future? It's absolutely, right? What you are seeing is as we get more and more people, there's more and more mouths to feed, and there is more space consumed by cities and residential and stuff like that. So the ability to be able to deliver on the food requirements is going to need to be expanded, not just in the traditional farmland, but in more of a vertical farming space. So it's definitely something that's going to be important. I think in terms of that breakdown right now from a, say, hydroponics versus dirt versus large, I think what you're going to end up seeing is somewhat kind of a mixture of all of it, just depending on the environment and kind of what is easiest to do. So, if you have access to soil that's going to be potentially farmable and easy to use, then that might be something where if it's in an area that is conducive to growing outside, obviously you're going to do some of that. But for more of your areas where you're starting to see very stringent building requirements, I think that's when you'll start to see a little bit more of this maybe water, this indoor kind of hydroponics idea of how you're going to grow from there. So I do think you're going to end up seeing a mixture of it. I think it's also going to be that idea of like, how does the cost drive down in terms of being able to make it effective? So just looking at it, a cell phone 20 years ago was not nearly as powerful or as cheap as it is now. I think as you see sensor networks start to become cheaper, more lightweight, less power, that's what's really going to kick it off. And I know people keep saying, when is IoT going to be here? What is those billions of devices? I think you're kind of on that cusp where you're starting to see some of these applications come through. I think you're probably like 5 years away from being able to say, hey, this is a big explosion, that we'll start to see more and more of this take off. But you're even starting to see some of this now within local cities that you're having kind of some of the more of these vertical ventures from a growth perspective.
Awesome. We had a couple of questions here about just like sunlight versus artificial light. So kind of getting back to that, like indoor versus outdoor.
Mm-hmm.
Are there studies that show that artificial light is better or worse than sunlight?
So there are, I'm not particularly familiar with these studies, but I'll talk a little bit about some of my experience working with some of these technology companies that do focus around LED growth lights. Obviously, some of the things that you're going to look at there are certain phases within plant growth that different pieces of the light spectrum are important. And so one of the things when I talked to one of these customers that they were mentioning was getting that fix on that nanometer frequency or wavelength for the red light was something that was really, really important. And so the other aspect of this, sorry, so I'll finish that thought and then I'll go to the next one. So the red light aspect of it is that there are particular frequencies that respond best and make a best environment in terms of being able to kind of go through the growth process. Sunlight is going to be kind of that very particular. You have obviously that broad spectrum of visible light, and then you have things like UV that are going to be associated with that. The other piece that is kind of this not really quantifiable here is around just conditions of your environment outside, right? So solar energy is really effective when it's right over, right on top, right ahead. But when you start to think about as the sun tilts, you're getting a little bit of a different kind of wavelength in terms of where that kind of angle of incidence is coming in. The other piece of that is if you're cloudy, now you're not necessarily getting as much of that visible light spectrum. It's going to be it's going to be a little bit darker, so you're not going to be able to get it as much solar energy as you might particularly. So one of the reasons why you could see LEDs become very effective is they're on 100% of the time and they're giving you exactly what you want. So it's somewhat and when you're looking at that studies, that's going to be one of the reasons why you start to see that those are used, particularly in those indoor environments, is you can set exactly the color and the nanometer and the wavelength, as well as you can have 100% uptime if you want, and you can be able to set the exact conditions. So there are studies around there, but that's going to be kind of when I look at the reasons that LEDs are going to be used in that perspective and why they're optimal for that. It's definitely around those kind of two items.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Thanks. Okay, another question here. This is more around like the cost. So I don't know if you can answer this off the top of your head or if maybe this person should reach out, but what are the entry-level costs of basic IoT applications?
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit in particular around IoT as a whole, and then I'll talk into just kind of smart ag. So IoT as a whole has gone down significantly from an entry-level cost perspective. There are plenty of controllers out there that you can get that enable you to communicate over Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Zigbee, so on and so forth, that are, even sub $10, very consistently between like 10 and 25 bucks. There are things like the Raspberry Pi that, hey, it has built-in Wi-Fi on the chip, so you can already be able to do some of the communication from that front. A lot of what you're going to find around this from a particular to smart ag is the basis around the sensors for that pH and that moisture. For the most part, you can find things out there that are light sensing. We built a stack for this at CES, I think in 2017, where we had kind of multiple dev boards stacked on top of each other and they were just working. So there are off-the-shelf options that are out there that you can probably do this for, $100, $200, somewhere in that range. The caveat I'll make there is again around precision and how much data do you need to collect, right? So as you start to get higher precision, as you start to look at building out a whole ecosystem, obviously your cost is going to rise. But if you were wanting to start with just a basic IoT application, hey, I want to build a mobile app that connects over the internet and I'm able to hand data back and forth, you could do that for a very reasonable level. The smart ags might be just a little bit more expensive just because of those sensors.
Got it. Got it. This one might be a little bit too in the weeds as well, but has any work been done to add machine learning on IoT Edge to help inspect the plant health?
So I won't necessarily be able to quote you an exact thing that's done, but I can say that the answer is yes, just on some of the research that I've done. You're going to see it very much emerging in some of these newer companies, right? So machine learning and artificial intelligence is kind of this new buzz that's kind of going where it's getting better and better as time goes on. So when you're looking at doing some of those edge analytics and being able to do some machine learning that says, if this, then that, like help me kind of control some of the conditions, help me be smarter about it. I've seen there was a couple of different TED Talks that I've seen where people were talking a little bit about how are they using machine learning at those edge to kind of make some of those decisions. I will say this, it's still in a very infant phase. This is not something that's widely used. It's not something that you could say, hey, I have a very particular company that I can go to and they are the leader in that. I don't necessarily know that space as much, but I will say that there's definitely people that are doing this. And it's an area that's really, really interesting when you start to think about how can we better deploy, could we potentially automate a whole range of fields where you're just having these giant plots of lands that are being controlled by kind of this automation perspective. I think it's an area that you're going to definitely see growth in.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Keaton, thank you so much for answering all of those questions. Super helpful, super informative. I learned a ton. Everyone, if we weren't able to get to your questions, don't worry. If you join the Aero certification program, you can gain access to a free engineering review, manufacturing consultation, all of that good stuff with an expert at Aero, and they can also connect you with analog devices. So to join, just visit our landing page, enterprise.indiegogo.com/Aero, fill out the quick form, and someone from Aero will be in touch. Thank you again, Keaton, for everything today. And thank you everyone for attending our webinar. We will see you next time. Bye, everyone.
Stay safe.
Thanks, Keaton. Talk to you
Bye-bye.
later. Bye.